the spit puzzle in Monkey Island 2 is a great one, right? I have to look at the wind gauge, I have to do the right sequence of clearing my throat, and I have to drink the thing that makes my spit thick. And all these things, like a kid could actually figure those out. And it's like this eureka moment, and you realize you're in conversation with the game developer, and that conversation came to a mutual understanding in some hilarious way. How do you make the dialogue in service of that eureka moment and that satisfying point of interaction rather than being about um, the sort of emotional impact of the text? And sometimes it's not just about cutting back dialogue, it's about changing the design so the dialogue isn't necessary because something is visually cued rather than told through a piece of dialogue.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Game Engineering Podcast. Today I'm joined by Mark, a lawyer by day and game designer and writer for Wormwood Studios by night. Mark worked on a series of games, but today we heavily focus on two of his indie projects, Primordia and Strangeland. Both of these are point-and-click adventure games. Both of these tackle deep problems in their narrative, and both of these can be bought dirt cheap on Steam or GOG and pretty much run on all platforms including Linux and OS X. This conversation will be much more insightful if you know the story and characters beforehand, so I highly recommend you play or watch the playthrough from these games to get as much as possible from Mark's insights. And he's a deep thinker, so there's a lot to absorb. And with that, let's meet Mark. You've worked on a lot of games, writing narrative for them, and most of them were adventure games. So before we move into the dialogue and writing, can you tell me what is an adventure game in general and how it differs from different games?
It's almost as controversial as asking me what is an RPG. I think, these genre boundaries have changed over time. For me, when I talk about an adventure game, the sort of core image I have in my head are the 1990s point and click adventures that LucasArts and Sierra came out with. The genre is much bigger than that because it also encompasses text adventures going back decades before Sierra and LucasArts were making those games. It includes parser adventure games that Sierra was making before the point and click system. And then it also includes first person games like Myst, uh, third person isometric games like Sanitarium, all kinds of games that have different elements. To me, the fundamental distinction between adventure games and role playing games is whether the emphasis is on solving puzzles in a non-violent way or whether the emphasis is on progressing through combat. That is a very rough dividing line, and it's not philosophically satisfying because there's nothing about playing a role that entails killing things. Conversely, there's nothing particularly adventurous about solving puzzles. But in practice, that seems to me to be a pretty effective dividing line. Adventure games tend not to have stats. They tend not to have an economic resource like gold that you can use to buy items. Each item tends to have a unique function rather than being defined by stats itself. Whereas in a role playing game, you have an economy, you have a variety of items that just adjust the character stats and things like that. It's not easy though, because you then run into games at the margins. There are people who would say Planescape Torment or Disco Elysium are adventure game like. What do you do with Quest for Glory, which obviously has role playing elements in it? But at least when I talk about it, the adventures would be point and clicks. And so, yeah, on those, the two that I worked on as the writer and designer on Primordia and Strangeland. Uh, and then in terms of role playing games, I actually think I've worked on more role playing games than adventure games. There's Dragon Age Origin, Torment Tides of Numenera, and Fallen Gods. And then a Game Boy Japanese role playing game called Infinity. Um, you know, Computer role playing game fans tend to call Japanese role playing games adventure games. So I don't want to police the definitions, but at least when I'm using it, the distinction is between do you level up and kill enemies, do you gather items and solve puzzles?
We'll later on go through Primordia, Strangeland, and probably Fallen Gods a little bit. Before that, I want to first ask you, when you sit down to, let's say, a new thing like Strangeland or Primordia, a new kind of IP, how do you envision like writing for this world? Like how the world is being created? How do you create a new IP? What do you think about?
It varies project to project depending on whether um, it's a genre that I'm already fully immersed in, or whether it isn't. So, for example, Infinity, which was the first commercial game I worked on, I had spent basically 1992 to 1999 playing every Japanese role-playing game that was translated to the US. So Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the PlayStation. And there was nothing more for me, to study in order to do that. And so when I had that opportunity, I produced the script, which I think was 25,000 words in 3 days, because this was like it had just been building up in me for decades. This was a kind of game I wanted to make. I dreamed of making it. I loved the genre. Um, Similarly with Primordia, point and click adventures, it's something that I've been spent my whole life, or much of my life playing and dreaming of making, and had a lifelong love of robot stories, post-apocalyptic stories, and so that I was fully immersed there as well. Other projects, what I would do, for example, with Fallen Gods, I tried to read all of the Icelandic sagas, various versions of Norse mythology, histories of the Viking Age, um, you know, other mythologies that are adjacent, so things like the Kalevala, the Irish mythology, Celtic mythology, Anglo-Saxon poetry, everything I can to get my brain just like overflowing with the elements of that world that I want to, because the best kind of creation, I think, is a mix of intuitive and intentional. You want to have a lot that's just springing, you think, out of nowhere. Though really where it's springing out of is the all of the fertile soil that you've been developing in your head over time. But you also want to have an intentional element. And the best way for me to accomplish those things is to really immerse in it. And part of what I'm trying to do with that is uh, say I'm making like a space opera game. Players will have consciously and subconsciously a set of expectations of things that you can do and see and find in a space opera. If you have a space opera in which you don't get to blast an enemy with a beam weapon from a spaceship, people are going to be really disappointed. This was one of the things, the few things that people were disappointed about in Descent Free Space. The first one is that the beam weapons were unsatisfying. One of the things that makes Free Space 2 better than Free Space 1 and one of the most memorable space operas of all time is the beam weapons are really great. Another thing, there's going to have to be a former adversarial alien who humanity fought to near obliteration, who turns out to be an ally against an even worse alien. Every space opera player is going to expect something like that. And the only way to know what those expectations will be is to just fully immerse yourself in the genre. You could do that by reading TV tropes or something, and but then it's like eating a multivitamin rather than having a full nutritious diet. You're not going to get the things that other editors haven't realized are important. Um, so that's basically the dividing line, and not everything is as binary as Fallen Gods read everything and Infinity produce it in 3 days. It's usually somewhere in between those two.
So this would be an answer how you come up with this setting. You're just ingrained in the world and kind of like both intentionally and unintentionally kind of soak up what would be the area or setting. And how about more like narrative characters happening, point A to point B, mystery, stuff like that.
Yeah. So there are two answers. Like there is the functional side of the characters and the narrative side of the characters. And this is, I think, one of the things that sets games apart from movies or comics or books or things like that. The place you start is uh, what should the avatar of the player be able to do in the game? If it's an adventure game, as we talked about, you're going to have puzzles. Those you're going to have not so much fighting. The puzzles are in a point and click driven by inventory items. The puzzles are often about combining inventory items. And so, the things we know the player is going to be doing, picking up everything that's not nailed down and putting it in his inventory, trying to combine everything in his inventory with everything else in his inventory, uh, coming up with creative uses of items that are not the obvious way to use an item, talking with NPCs and helping NPCs with their problems, not killing people who are standing in your way. So if those are the things we know are you can and can't do, you want to have a character who fits those qualities. If you made the Doom Marine the protagonist of an adventure game, there would be a disconnect because why can't I use the BFG to just shoot my way through the doorman who says you can't come in without an ID? No one's going to want to solve a puzzle for that because you're going to undermine the characteristics of the protagonist. So, for Primordia, that meant, I wanted a protagonist who was a scavenger, a protagonist who was technically skilled at dealing with machinery, and a protagonist who had an ethical code that would limit the number of things he could do and take, right? So Horatio won't take everything that's not nailed down literally, because he has certain views about private property that prevent him from stealing from everyone. He won't kill people to get past them because he's processing how to go from being a destroyer to a builder, how to go from being a soldier to a monk almost. And so these characteristics for the protagonist are actually driven by gameplay considerations to try to harmonize those two things. And the same thing is true of the other characters you meet in an adventure game. They need to be characters who have problems to solve because if they don't have a problem to solve, they there's not much to do with them in the context of an adventure game. And they need to also be in a position to help you advance on your own main quest. So, this sort of defines functionally the roles that the characters can have. Um, so those are sort of two functional considerations. And then turning to the narrative side, um, I, you know, many years ago when I played Chrono Trigger and then Planescape Torment, I had, I don't want to say an epiphany because I think millions of people also came to the same conclusion and it's nothing brilliant. But I realized how important the silhouette of a character is. So this is literally the sprite's silhouette is really important. This is something that Disney animators have known for a long time, that you don't want it to depend on seeing every detail of a character to be able to distinguish them. At a second, you should know this is Mickey Mouse, this is Donald Duck, whatever it is. And if you look at Chrono Trigger, the characters have very distinctive silhouettes. If you compare that to Final Fantasy VI, the silhouettes are actually not distinct at all. They all follow this head is a third of the body, and the body is the remaining two thirds. They look somewhat like maybe they were worked off of a sprite sheet where they had a generic sprite and then touched them up. Uh, Chrono Trigger isn't like that at all. The characters are all different heights, different widths, different configurations of head, body, proportions, different shapes. Uh, and Planescape Torment, you see the same thing. If you compare the sprites in Planescape Torment to the sprites in Baldur's Gate 2, Baldur's Gate 2, the characters are all basically the same build and height and shape. And whereas in Planescape Torment, you have woman with a tail, a woman with wings. You have a robot that's made up of two boxes with spindly limbs. You have
Flying
a
skull.
gigantic,
Okay.
exactly, yeah. So, and instantly, you could put if you blacked out the silhouettes of the Baldur's Gate characters and the Torment characters, no one could tell you this is. I don't even remember the Baldur's Gate character. Minsk maybe you could distinguish, but I don't know. Yeah, I would not immediately say this is one character versus another. Um, Narratively, you also want silhouettes in the same way. Not if you're writing, the most sophisticated great American novel, but that's not what we're making, right? We're making video games. And what that means is you want each character to have a certain style of speech. You want them to have a certain set of actions that are like the thing they do. This is the guy who breaks down walls. This is the guy who climbs over walls. This is, the one who always has a sarcastic joke. This is the one who hardly ever says anything. And these, dramatic, sort of strong silhouettes uh, help a player immediately feel like there is substance to a character. It's ironic because a sophisticated literary critic would tell you this is the most superficial kind of character. But when you don't have 300 pages of dense text to convey the details of a character like Oswald in Primordia, right? Oswald doesn't have very much dialogue. So with him, you want to have, preposterous, cane and, monocle and whatever. Oswald has the monocle, Cornelius has the cane. You want to have this pompous accent. You want to have all of these sort of Shakespearean theatrical ways of speech. And all of that within 3 lines of his dialogue, the player would be able to tell you from seeing the silhouette of his sprite or from seeing 1 line of his dialogue, whether this is him speaking or Crispin speaking or Horatio speaking. And so when you accept that principle that everyone needs a different silhouette, you quickly realize there are only so many different silhouettes that exist in the world, and it starts forcing you to distinguish characters. So in Strangeland, for instance, initially the scribe and the fortune teller both had full dialogues. It turned out they had extremely similar patterns of speech, and sort of they were both had this skaldic prophet kind of style of speech. And in order to distinguish them, that was why I made the fortune teller into this more mechanical, you don't actually have a dialogue with him, because it was important to distinguish them in that way. So again, that's sort of like those are the parameters that start it. And then once I have those parameters, then every character is always some combination of uh, literary material. Literary, I would include games, comics, movies, whatever, but source material that someone else has created, and then something from my own life. I can't just like come up with something that has no substance in my brain to begin with, right? So I'm always drawing from one thing or another. But if you take Horatio, for instance, Horatio, on the one hand, has these elements taken from the Nameless One in Planescape Torment. He's drawing on Clint Eastwood's character in Gran Torino. Uh, and then at the same time, he's drawing on this uh, very religious, very smart former construction worker I went to law school with, who, you know, my experience of talking with him and probing his beliefs when we were in law school, and he's been a friend of mine for, I guess, 20 years now. Um, Really, he stood out to me. He is a person in my life who has this distinctive silhouette, and I took some of that and put it on to this framework from the Nameless One, and that's how he came about. With Mort, with Crispin, you have like Mort, Cedric, Orko, all of these floating sidekicks who have been a big part of my mind since I was a little kid. Um, uh, you know, Years before Primordia, a friend of mine and I were making an adventure game that also had a hero with a floating sidekick. who was named Horus. He was actually a demon named Uros, and but he was a sarcastic floating sidekick. And I was like, you have to have a sarcastic floating sidekick. But then Crispin's voice and his is very much my own. Like he's the most authorial insert character. That kind of snarkiness is the way I act with my friends. And so, all of these characters in one way or another, those are the sources I'm drawing on.
Okay. How about the, um, let's say, the main quest, the main mystery that is presented? Because we've touched on the setting and the characters, and also like about the plot, the actual series of events that will happen.
So it's the same method where there you start with like the mechanics of a game. The verbs that drive the action of the game have to be the same verbs that are mapped onto the player's controls. By which I mean, if you're making a game about killing aliens, but you can't kill aliens except in cutscenes, there's a disconnect between the player and the gameplay. If it's going to be that the goal of the game is to kill aliens, it should be a shooting game and you shoot aliens. It's not necessarily the game I would make, but and then that means that the story has to be a story in which the crisis can be resolved by killing aliens. It's extremely disappointing to have a game where the plot is kill aliens and then you get to the end and actually the solution was not kill aliens, it was hack a computer, because hacking a computer was not something the player was ever able to do. It's not something the character was ever doing. And so it's an unsatisfying conclusion. So again, in the context of an adventure game, you have to start from a crisis that is about gathering and combining items, and it's not about killing aliens because that's not what the player is going to do. So it fundamentally is, gather items, gather things, help NPCs, and solve a puzzle, right? The puzzle should be something, you know, I guess I would say is not necessarily that the puzzle is narratively being solved is an adventure game puzzle. You don't have to literally say it's a Tower of Mahjong and you have to complete that to save the world, but more that again, so that there is this harmony between the player verbs, the character verbs, and the narrative verbs. You want to present the this as being a knot to untangle. So in Primordia, there's a technical problem. The technical problem is we are missing the part that we need for this machine to operate. That is a quintessential adventure game puzzle. That was what I wanted to be the central thing, is not, kill an alien. It's not kill your nemesis. It's not avenge, yourself on the robot who stole the power core. It's I just need to get my machine working and I need a piece to get it working. In Strangeland, it is a more psychological knot that the protagonist is trying to untangle. But in both of those cases, it is a puzzle for them to solve. In a role playing game context, I think that would be a very unsatisfying kind of narrative because, again, if the principal thing that you do in role playing games is kill enemies and level up, fundamentally the challenge, this is why there should be a boss battle at the end, because and it does, I guess it doesn't have to literally be a boss battle. It could be, something where you use skills, non-combat skills, if it's an RPG that has a big non-combat component. But it should be something where the things that you've been doing all along are the things that enable you to achieve success at the end. um, so I think for me, one of the great indie RPGs, and in fact, great RPGs of all time, is The Age of Decadence by Iron Tower Studio. Um, that's a game where there are many different ways that you can win the game, and they are designed to showcase the skills that your character build has, and sort of show how, yeah, you can be a talking character and win the game through talking. You could be a mechanical character and win the game through mechanical solutions or whatever these are. But they always have to be tied into the skills. The thing that is fundamentally unsatisfying to me is say you had like a JRPG style game where uh, it's the only way you really interact with the world is by killing enemies. At least the ones I grew up playing. I know they've gotten more sophisticated now. And then the final encounter of the game is not a boss battle, but a puzzle or just a long interactive cutscene. I would be disappointed by that because it would feel like the thing that I've been building up, the strength that I've been training for, is not actually relevant to the final struggle.
You make it sound so obvious, and I would never think about it this way. That you need to have in RPG, since you're the one who is leveling up and gaining new abilities and making yourself stronger, you should be the person who defeats something at the end to have the satisfying conclusion. And in adventure game you don't have this element, you don't have this growing stronger element, but you have the elements of searching for items, looking for things, looking for solutions. It's You make it sound like it's obvious. It's like, why wouldn't you think about it? Okay. Tell me, in case of writing dialogue specifically for adventure games, are there any overarching rules that you found to be true over your experience, like how to do it properly, how to nail the dialogue in adventure games?
So the answer is no, because they're adventure games that are written totally differently that people love. So the idea that there's only one formula that works can't possibly be true. The approach that Dave Gilbert takes is very different from the approach I take. We're, writing stories in the same engine, the same graphical style, similar gameplay, and yet our approaches are so different. His games get rave reviews for their writing. Our games have gotten good reviews for their writing. So I wouldn't pretend that my way is right and his way is wrong. And of course, it's even more dramatic as you look at games farther afield. Dropsy has no dialogue at all, yet people love its story. Same with Anita games; they have no dialogue, or they have very simplistic dialogues. Um, so all I can say is, I can talk about my approach, and uh, you know, this some of this cross cuts adventure games and role playing games. I don't know that this is the best way to do it, but I feel committed to this view, which is the thing that I dislike most are uh, dialogues that go nowhere. So there's like I'm going to butcher his name, but there is a Leos Egri wrote this book about playwriting, and he talks about in plays dialogue that goes nowhere because there's no conflict between philosophical ideas of the two characters. He says basically every dialogue should be about an antithesis that, in this sort of Marxian sense of, one character has one position on a philosophical point, the other one has another, and they fight, and either one prevails or you end up with synthesis. But there always needs to be something like that. I have a similar feel that games, as much as players seem to love dialogues that go nowhere in games, I don't think it's a good design strategy. I don't like the classic sort of BioWare has these a lot where it's you're talking to a character and say, "Tell me about the city." And the character says, "Well, what would you like to hear about? The docks, the market, the royal district?" And you say, "The docks." Well, there's ships that are coming from all around the world. They come from Morocco. They come from Calais. They come from London. Well, tell me about London. London is the capital of the British Empire. The British Empire, tell me about it. And it's like you're in a Wikipedia
Yeah.
fugue state. And then in order to create the facade of gameplay, at random, some of these will just give you an experience bonus or a stat bonus or unlock something later on, but none of it is sort of conventionally what we would think of as gameplay. It's just going through a laundry list because it turns out that you can pick all of these topics. The only thing you're in control of is the order in which you go through these topics. It's very hard to avoid that because you want to convey information to the player. Both Primordia and Strangeland have this, at various points, there are characters who are just like exposition trees. Um, but I don't think that's a great thing. I think it's better if the dialogue is as short as possible, if it's driving you towards the gameplay, back into the gameplay, rather than, you know, treating the story as something that exists in its own place that's not tied to the actual action you're doing. The other thing I will just say is, uh, the overwhelming majority of lines of dialogue in Primordia and Strangeland, I think, are not dialogues in the traditional sense. They are the one-liners that the protagonist gives, or in Primordia's case, it'll sometimes be Horatio says something, then Crispin responds. When you try an item interaction or click on a hotspot or click on a hotspot for 14 times in a row or whatever it is, in those uh, to me are really like they do a lot of the work in an adventure game to define the characters. And what's nice about them is that they don't bog down the game a lot. They're just like a, quick throwaway, a joke, a clue, a joke and a clue. And, they help give you a comfort. It's like you're on a road trip with someone and bantering with them as opposed to reading a Wikipedia article. So, you know, I don't have none of this leads to like a great formula, but in general, I'm always trying to find a way to cut back my impulse for more dialogue in adventure games. And that's true in Fallen Gods too. Fallen Gods, I think we find it's not, it, it's somewhere between an adventure game and a role playing game, but I think it has achieved my goal of always having things be propulsive rather than recursive. So there you do have choice lists, but you don't go, it's not like you ever go back to the list a second time. It's like once you make a choice, you're on a path and the path might fork again, but it doesn't curve back to where it started. And I just think that's, you know, in general, players like a sense of forward momentum in a game. I think in general, stories work better when they have forward momentum to them.
I once heard that, like, in a game, in terms of game writing, you can't have a line that doesn't add anything to, like, doesn't add anything of value either to a plot or to like a character, that is like empty line, just said for the kind of sake of saying or repeating something that was said before. Would you say that you agree with this? Like,
It's one, yes, that is consistent with everything I just said, but it is one of those like empty platitudes in the sense that it is begging the question of what is the line adding to the game. So, for
yeah,
instance, Disco Elysium is full of what you could call throwaway lines. You could remove them without impeding an interaction or anything like that. But those lines are what make Disco Elysium. And if you took them all out, there would be nothing of note left. The same is true of like, uh, any number of the obscure interactions. Like, when you'd use the bird head on the rat body in your inventory in Strangeland, there's like a throwaway joke about not wanting to go into Frankenstein taxidermy or whatever. And, uh, you know, it doesn't do anything other than validate for the player that this is something that, yeah, you thought this was a funny thing to do, and the game acknowledges it and is riffing back with you. There are some places where you can obviously say, um, if you had sort of line after line of generic, pointless dialogue from NPCs in a role playing game, at some point it would be better just to use, you click on the pointless NPC and the NPC just says, "Good day, sir," and it doesn't even open a dialogue window, right? That's what a lot of, Fallout 1, I think, has that. Baldur's Gate had that. Planescape has that. That strikes me as better than if every NPC you click on them and you go into kind of like a Morrowind style, purely generic, empty thing. And yet people loved those Morrowind dialogues too. And so I don't know. Yes, in principle, it's like, I don't know, Antoine Saint-Exupéry, whatever that, the Little Prince author has that quote from his book on flying that shows up in Civilization. Like the true skill is not how much you can add, but how much you can take away. And the elegance of a plane is that everything that's possible to take away from it has been taken away from it, and nothing is there that's not functional. So stipulated, but with art, there's sometimes things function just by feeling, and I don't know. In gaming too, I'm not sure I could. I'm not sure I could point to anything in a game and say that line added nothing for every. No player got anything out of that line. There's probably someone who got something out of every line in every game, and so that's why I just think this principle is great in theory, but I'm not sure how practical it is.
So how would you, if you write a dialogue, how would you know when to stop, when when to when to stop adding like flavor, kind of jokey things, where to cut the phrases?
Uh, I don't have a formula. I mean, I think it's you have to let the player do. If there is something that a player would be frustrated that she can't do, right? You meet an NPC who has an arrow sticking out of his head, and you don't have a question, why do you have an arrow sticking out of your head? The player is going to think the writer left something out of that dialogue. Even if it now there shouldn't be an arrow in a character's head unless the arrow is an item that you need to get out of his head to solve some puzzle elsewhere or whatever. It would be such an absurd red herring to have. And if it's something that's then you're whatever, then of course you're gonna have a dialogue for it. But uh in Strangeland, that was sort of my principle is reduce down the topics you can ask about to the minimum that is necessary to satisfy the player's, you know, most demanding list of things that if I can't ask about those, I'm frustrated. Um, and then, the other principle is just you sort of play it and you play test it and you watch people play test it and see if they're getting bogged down. Um, and sometimes it's not just about cutting back dialogue, it's about changing the design so the dialogue isn't necessary because, something is visually cued rather than told through a piece of dialogue or, um, a puzzle is more logical, so it doesn't need all the sort of explanatory text surrounding it. Um, and this is a tangent on what you were asking, but it was a sufficiently interesting moment in my life that I've always tried to find an excuse to shoehorn it in the conversation. So my daughters have played adventure games basically since they could talk, because my older daughter Eleanor, who is she's actually wrote a line of dialogue or came up with a line of dialogue and voiced a line of dialogue in Primordia. She was like 2 months old when I started the game and 2.5 when we released the game. And my daughter Alice was born about 6 months before we finished the game. And, they just grew up with Primordia, and from Primordia got to Loom, Monkey Island, Pajama Sam, and we Amanita's games. We played like 20 or 30 adventure games. And if you had asked me, when did the Monkey Island franchise fundamentally change from a gameplay standpoint? I would say from a gameplay standpoint, it fundamentally changed between the third and the fourth games. Something got worse and broke in that move. I would not have said something changed between the second and the third game. I would say visually, this third game is totally different from the first two games, but the gameplay is essentially the same. And then I played those three games with my daughters. And what struck me is they're very impatient and they don't like to listen to all the dialogue in adventure games. The first two Monkey Island games you can play and complete without reading all the dialogue or listening to all the dialogue if it's voiced, because the puzzles are intuitive and they may be based on cartoon logic rather than real world logic, but they are very tactile and visual. When you get to Monkey Island 3, you start to get these puzzles that are nonsensical even within cartoon logic. I don't mean like they are illogical so much as that they are alogical. They just exist outside of any logical framework that You
Yeah.
know, an example of this is like you have to blow a bubble in the restaurant where you also have a chicken suit, but there's like a step where you have to like chew gum and blow a bubble. We got completely stuck on that because all of the sequence of puzzles in that restaurant are driven by things in the dialogue. There are a few environmental cues, but it is basically like you have to listen to the dialogue or you have no idea what to do. And that is endemic throughout Monkey Island 3. I would generally say that is not the right approach to adventure game design. It's fine, you know, I don't think adventure games are primarily dialogue delivery tools. I think adventure games are primarily about the the thing that adventure games have that nothing else has is the joy of solving a puzzle and that sense of connection it gives you with the game and the game developer and other players of like, oh my God, I had this idea that what I have to do is, the spit puzzle in Monkey Island 2 is a great one, right? I have to look at the wind gauge, I have to do the right sequence of clearing my throat, and I have to drink the thing that makes my spit thick. And all these things, like a kid could actually figure those out. And it's like this eureka moment and you realize you're in conversation with the game developer and that conversation came to a mutual understanding in some hilarious way. That's the thing that no other kind of game quite offers that same experience. Many games offer dialogues, interactive dialogues. Visual novels do, role-playing games do. uh, Action games can have cutscenes, all those things. And so uh, you know there's a very roundabout way of saying, um, like, always my view on adventure games is how do you make the dialogue in service of that eureka moment and that satisfying point of interaction rather than being about the sort of emotional impact of the text or the intellectual impact of the text. Obviously, I love writing, and so I don't think those things are worth nothing. You look at the player reviews, it's obvious they're worth a lot. And so I would never give those up. I would never make a game like Dropsy or Machinarium where there's no dialogue at all. It would be frustrating for me to give up that discipline. But but I also think you don't want to have the writing overgrow the gameplay. It's like a vine that kills a tree.
Okay. Okay. One thing that I need to ask you before we jump into Primordia, or actually take a break. Uh, you're a lawyer and you write games, adventure games, both narratively and dialogue wise. So what are the parallels of working as a lawyer and then writing these short quips and funny dialogues for adventure games?
So I actually wrote an article about this for a legal
Really?
publication because I think they're quite dramatic. So the simplest answer is now everyone is conventional wisdom among litigators, that's lawyers who do lawsuits, that litigation is about storytelling. Obviously, most video games now also contain a storytelling component. And so the very easy answer is both of them are about storytelling. The place where I think video game writing is actually more like lawyer writing than book writing is or movie writing is that uh, really effective legal writing makes the legal decision maker feel like the protagonist of the story. So the the best thing is not for the client, the judge to think, Mark's client is the hero of the story, and this is a great story about Mark's heroic client. The thing that I want the judge to think is, I, you know, Judge Smith am the hero of this story. And the heroic ending of the story is for me to rule in favor of Mark's client. And that is right. That's what video game writing is about. I don't want the player to think my character is the hero. I want the player to think the player, am the hero. And so strategically, I think that's the way the two of them have like an overlap. Also, uh, although a legal brief is an uninteractive document. A judge just reads a brief. But cases have interaction between the judge, the jury, and the lawyers. And particularly the judge and the lawyers. The jury doesn't have as much ability to interact with the lawyers, but it is a reciprocal relationship in the way that a game writer and his players are in a relationship, which not if it's a truly uninteractive cutscene, but in our adventure games, it's always we are giving the player different choices, but we have to constrain those choices because we don't have the resources to make a truly open world adventure game where it's all simulationist. And I'm not particularly interested in making that. What I want to do is constrain the player's choices to drive them towards a particular narrative that I've crafted, but make that narrative feel like it's the one they want to pursue, right? They want to pick among the choices I've limited them to. They don't want to just say, oh, the version of Primordia I'm going to play is the one where Horatio never gets out of the ship and just sits there, and I'm going to, role play that by never advancing out of that room in the game. And so similarly, when you're litigating a case, the judge is going to be able to make decisions. You have to sort of plan responses to those decisions, and you have to figure out how to constrain them so that whichever of these choices the judge makes, they're still sort of channeled towards a particular outcome, which is the outcome that we want. Um, and then so that's how game writing I think helps as a lawyer. As a game writer, the way I think law has helped me is number one, you have to become a mini expert on everything you litigate. You have to learn if I'm doing a case involving nuclear power generation, I have to learn something about nuclear power and radiation. If I'm doing a case about medical malpractice, I have to learn something about the medical procedure. If I'm doing something about a patent over some device, by the way, we could do this all day. So similarly, when I approach game writing, I try to become a little expert on all kinds of things, right? A little expert on each character. If I have a character who's going to speak like Ever Faithful speaks in this kind of King James Bible cadence, um, you know, you want to be, you don't just want to fake it. Like I don't particularly like the bad kind of medieval thee thou thing that some games do. I really want to immerse myself in it. And if we're going to have jokes about um, different some kind of technological jokes in a game that may require a little bit of research too. In Fallen Gods, there's a point where, when you're sailing, one of the sailing events, there's like a boring guy on the ship who's describing every part of the ship to you. And this was like a thing. Viking ships, every board had a term for that kind of board because they were so intimately connected to the ships that they built. But you have to actually research that to know that. And I think that discipline helps as a writer, is taking the sort of research skill. And then the other is everything as a lawyer, you are constrained by space. Every brief has a page limit, a word limit, and things like that. And so, when I'm trying to scale back the length of dialogues or something, that kind of discipline is helpful too.
You already come prepared. Let's turn our heads to Primordia now. And you kind of alluded to this beforehand regarding your love of robots beforehand. Uh, Tell me a little bit how Primordia story came about, how Primordia narrative came about, really.
Uh, Well, so there were already some outlines of a narrative and some sketches of areas in the game that Victor Flug had done before I joined. I think it's about 3 days before I joined. He had done some like basic ideas where you want to make a robot game, you want it to be in a wasteland, and you want there to be a big city. I think Beneath the Steel Sky had been a big inspiration on him as a game that I had played, didn't love as much as he did, but basically the same premise where you'd start in the wasteland, you would then go to the big city. Um, and so that part of it was already there. For me, uh, there were basically two or three different strands of things some going all the way back to early childhood and some more recent. So one was when I was a kid, uh, we watched a cartoon show called The Challenge of the GoBots. It was basically a knockoff version of Transformers that had cheaper toys. And my parents would not buy us Transformers toys because they were too expensive. So we were GoBots fans. And the GoBots had um, unlike Transformers, it was basically set in a world in which there weren't humans. At least that's my recollection of it. And then there was like a two-part episode, maybe in the second season, where uh, the robots know that they were built by humans in the first instance, and there's like this mythological figure who's been alluded to called the last engineer, and they go out to try to find the last engineer, and they find who they think is the last engineer, and it turns out he's actually, I think he's called like the last renegade. He's a bad human, and then they eventually find the good human. And anyway, this idea of robots and their relationship to humans had always been very powerful for me in a way different from like Planet of the Apes, because there is this creator created relationship between human beings and robots that is more like how we imagine the relationship between a God creator and we created beings, and versus the sort of like fluke or happenstantial way in which Planet of the Apes sets up the inheritor species. The inheritor species takes me to the second key inspiration, which is my great aunt, who was a really important part of my childhood, was a poet, and she wrote a poem called The Inheritors that is about the last two humans on Earth who are in a zoo essentially. But it begins with this opening stanza, which is like, I sing of the race that came to be after man's brief tyranny over all beasts ceased, and we became a theory in another species prehistory, endowed as theories often are with false glories and iniquities. The truth is, we lost our vision. In the man pit of night, we fought for light, and with faith and fission lit one blaze too bright. The world will never know such light again, or no, the world will never see such light again, nor know the good and worth that was in men. And it then goes on for 45 pages. It's sort of an epic poem. But that opening concept of becoming a theoretical figure in some other species prehistory had a deep impact on me as a kid because, of course, I don't know if this is true for children in Poland, but at least in the 1980s for children in America, dinosaurs were the thing. And so this obsession with, and in the 80s, there was also this sort of like, um, we were at this inflection point in our understanding of dinosaurs. That, were they really more reptilian or were they more like warm-blooded birds? Uh, where this idea that maybe we had fundamentally misunderstood dinosaurs was very much present in my childhood. We would still have like old movies where dinosaurs were done with stop motion, and they were very different from how they were being depicted in Jurassic Park, which was when I was 12 or whatever. And so I liked the idea of like, what if we could, take that kind of a look at humanity, and what could we reveal about humanity if you had that space of distance? So, it wouldn't be a game primarily about robots talking about humanity. We would use robots to depict what aspects of humanity they inherited, and we could sort of examine and critique those things and appreciate those things in a way that is harder to do if Horatio were a human being and humanism were Christianity. It would evoke a completely different set of reactions from a player than what robot and humanism evokes from a player. So that was sort of strand two, and then strand three is this religious element. which I'm not religious at all. But my aunt and uncle were very religious Episcopalians, so I had some exposure to religion as a kid through them. And then when I went to law school, my wife and I got married very, very early for the United States for people in post-secondary education. It's, so the only people at law school who were married by age 24 were us and religiously Orthodox people. Evangelical Christians, religious Catholics, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, Mormons, but no one who was secular tended to be married at that age. So all of our friends were these couple friends, and I was exposed to people from a different mindset than I had really been exposed to outside of my aunt and uncle for most of my life. And I had this strong reaction to it that I thought computer games tended to not handle religion very well. It was typically done as um, like the church is a grand conspiracy is the normal framing mechanism in Final Fantasy Tactics or something, or that religion is this sort of like alien polytheistic thing where it's fantastical but isn't really trying to capture the experience of religion that we have in the West and 2024 or 2012 or whenever we were doing it. So I wanted to have one of the themes that we would explore in the game, like what if there were religious characters who weren't bad guys and their religion was complementary to their values rather than being a cover for illicit motives. Eh, But I also wanted to explore some of the shortcomings of that, and so those things kind of wove together. Um, the last piece of it is that I had been reading tons and tons of science fiction in preparation for another game I was working on, and one of the books I read was by an author named Clifford Simak. The book is called City. I don't particularly recommend the book on its literary merits, but it did have this impact on me that it's a post apocalyptic setting in which there are only robots and dogs left, I believe. And one of the things that no longer exists are cities. And so it's humanity doesn't exist, but cities don't exist. And you have these two elements in it that I wanted to riff on in Primordia, which were the sort of what does a city represent, and what do these what do the like imprints of our thumbs that are left on the world think of the thumbs that imprinted them? What do they imagine that those thumbs would have been like? And those were sort of the um, key things going into it. And then I had this idea that this is actually before I had read Leo Shagari's book, but it was the idea that he later formalized for me in my head, which is we should have these dyads, oppositional dyads throughout the game. So you have the division between where Horatio is at the start is this very self-centered independent, property rights oriented view of the world. What's mine is mine, and I don't want anyone else to bother with it. Leave me alone and let me solve my own problems. And on the other hand, you have Metromind, who has this collectivist mindset, which is the problems that we face cannot be solved independently. The only thing that could result in the success is if we eliminate all boundaries between people, between property, unify into a single whole, and then leverage that collective strength towards a solution. So that's one dyad you have. And then obviously you have clarity and charity are another dyad. You have the religious and the irreligious dyad. You have the violence, sort of thoughtless violence that Scraper represents. Uh, of course, Scraper is a building machine that is turned into a warrior. Horatio is a war machine who is turned into a builder. And so, this idea of throughout the game, you put these two poles against each other. And what does each one teach you about the other one? And at the end, of course, this is spoiler, but the game is quite old. Uh, Horatio doesn't go back in the good endings to being a hermit who's obsessed with his own property. He reaches this point of synthesis between his initial view and the collectivist view, which is essentially a voluntary collaboration is what's necessary, not a compulsory brain control by Metromind, but also not a completely self-absorbed mindset. Crispin is the one character who uh, is not on one of these two binary extremes. He is, he plays a role a little bit like a court jester, where he's able to talk to everyone and question everyone's beliefs, and in doing that, unsettles them enough that Clarity is able to relax some of the rigor of her logic, and Horatio is able to relax a little bit his self-absorption. Um, so anyway, that's a long answer to your short
Yeah.
question.
Uh, that was great. That was great. I did not expect that so much, so many things you managed to weave in into the story. It's so cool to like see this now with this information, see how this like lays out. Like you can kind of backtrack. I just played Primordia, so everything is fresh in my mind. So it's like, oh, okay, yeah, yeah, that makes much more sense. Like because sometimes, for example, I either like went through the dialogue too quickly to not get it, but now like also it also depends on the ending you get with Horatio, whether he ends up in this like nice state you've mentioned, because you can the game has multiple endings, and we can actually touch on that a little bit. What do you think of multiple endings uh, for a game like that, where you have kind of a narrative that sort of, I would say there is a one ending, the positive one, that is kind of like expected, right? But you also have additional endings. You have endings where you need to do something beforehand to unlock the ending, which is like kind of like a treasure kind of ending. So, how do you feel like? What do you feel about like making a couple of endings? And also in Strangeland, you don't get to do that. I think so. In Primordia, you have a lot of endings. So, what's your take now on the
Yeah.
multiple endings?
So, very early on, it was something that I said I thought was important was to have multiple endings to it, precisely because of the philosophical debates that are going on through the game. I think there are um, intellectually rigorous views that a player can have that compel one of these endings to be the best ending or not, right? That um, I actually think the blow it all up, option is like like yeah, someone could say um, vengeance and destroying, I think Metromind is a cancer, and blowing up the city to get rid of the cancer is a morally defensible thing, and that is actually um, integral to Horatio's character, right? That Horatio's journey was not an evolution away from being the Horus, this war machine bent on destroying Metropole. Instead, Horatio's journey was recovering the identity that he lost and getting back to who he truly was, his core logic, and vindicating that. So that to me is like that is a completely coherent way of viewing the story. Likewise, I think a completely coherent way of viewing the story is uh, Horatio gradually has his core beliefs about humanism, property rights, legalism undermined by things that happen, such that in the final interaction with Metromind, he actually could be persuaded that Metromind is right and he is wrong. And if you are persuaded of that, and she could be right. It could actually be that if Horatio just cooperated with her, they would be able to solve the sort of bigger puzzle, the outer shell, right? The inner shell of the puzzle is how does Horatio get back his power core and create this bubble of civilization within the wasteland. But the mission that Metromind has is a much bigger mission. The mission she has is how do we save the world, right? He's not interested. He's not trying to save the world. She is. And so maybe she's right. He should sacrifice his individuality in order to try to save the world. So that would be a reasonable ending. And if you've made the wrong choices and Horatio is left friendless, um, then maybe the jumping off the tower, and that's the closest he can get to flying again. In both games, flying and falling those are themes that have always mattered to me and are in basically every game that I've done. But this is the closest he can get to flying. It's the ultimate, you know, the power to say no, right? The one of the interesting things that the game starts with, Horatio doesn't shoot a laser back at Scraper, but he does simply say no. I'm not going. I can't stop you from doing this, but I can refuse to consent to this theft. And he does have this option at the end where I can't stop Metromind. I don't have the Thanatos virus. I'm not clever enough to blow the place up, but I'm not going to cut a deal with her either. So, each of these endings to me feels like it is consistent, and I wanted to give the player the opportunity to give that meaning to the story. I do have a sort of uncertainty about one decision I made, which was I felt it was really important that Horatio not be able to save the world. So early, one of the things I was contemplating as a possible outcome for the game is that you repair Metropole in some way. Horatio becomes the new Metromind, and he, is not going to be an oppressor. He's going to be a benevolent leader, and you see the city start to thrive again, and maybe there's hope for the world, right? And I ultimately decided, no, that's not what the story is about. The story is about conquering yourself, um, bringing, tending your garden as, like in Candide. It's not about saving the whole world. And in fact, some of the themes of the game are that these kinds of utopian goals tend to be counterproductive rather than productive. But the reason I say I have a question about this is even people who I consider to be quite sophisticated thinkers, readers, writers who play the game sometimes complain. It just feels anticlimactic. The thing that I want to do is I want to defeat Metromind and I want to help all these people. And you can't actually do either of those. You can't defeat her and get back to the unique. The only way to defeat her is one of these destructive endings, and there's nothing you can do to save the city. All the closest you get is by merging with her, and it raises this question whether maybe that will succeed. Although everything you've seen is that the method she's doing is running the place into the ground; it's not elevating it. And so I just don't know whether that was the right call. In Strangeland, we do have multiple endings, but unlike in Primordia, they are number one, there is so clearly one that is the right ending, which is you fly into the sky. You can jump as in Primordia, you can use the knife on yourself, and there's a similar go down fighting kind of ending that's like the ending in where you take the plasma torch and go fight Scraper, where you use the knife on the dark ego, then you just die fighting him. And those have slight, you get a different joke from the clown at the end, depending on which of those you choose. But they are like clearly secondary endings to what is a primary ending. And part of that was um, like Strangeland is a very, very personal game to me. Both games are very personal to me, but um, Strangeland began with my grandparents' death. The themes of it are basically thinking about that and also thinking about, you know, dark episodes in my own life, my relationship with my wife, and how that sort of pulled me out of that the darker moments of my life. And so I simply could not countenance an ending, a canonical ending that says no, the proper place for humanity is on its knees and in the mud, and there is no one, there is no light, there is no ascending out of the nightmare. You're stuck there forever, no matter what. I just, you know, ultimately, I think these games have to give people some level of hope, and so I felt that that was something important there.
Before we turn to the difficult subject that is Strangeland, first let me say that I found like naming charity and clarity the stroke of genius. Like you switch one letter, you express what they're all about in this one name. It's incredible. I don't know like whether it was like a shower thought or like a illumination that came upon you. This was genius. Was there is there a story to this?
This, so uh,
Maybe before.
I love wordplay. So, as I'm sure you've seen in both Strangeland and Primordia, this is like throughout coming up with things like facade as a curse word, or the rhyming stuff, and the homonyms in Strangeland. It's just I think some of this is neurological. Like they're at an extreme, if someone is a schizophrenic, they do this thing called clanging, where they just like associate words and sounds together and churn them forever. I don't think I'm at that level of neurotypicality, but
Yet.
my mind is always playing with the sound and the shape of words and how they fit together. It's just a hundred, you know, essentially 100% of the time, some portion of my brain is doing that. Um, the idea of having these two law clerks that represent oppositional poles is based on reality. When I was a law clerk, which was not long before I wrote Primordia, this was there was a judge on the Ninth Circuit who famously had those hired a clerk from both sides of the spectrum, and then the justice I clerked for on the Supreme Court was reputed to do that. I don't think he actually did, but people always would say he would hire one conservative and one liberal law clerk, and then he would have two who he didn't care about. But he always wanted to have one on each extreme to test the ideas that the other one had and make sure that he wasn't getting biased by having everyone from one perspective or another. So that was where the oppositional idea came from. And then, yeah, it was just this endless wordplay, with all the characters' names. There's a lot of um, both like wordplay and like, I don't know, embedded references. I don't know quite the way um, to like to articulate all of this, but like to give just an example, like Horatio, as I mentioned, like this had on one level its genesis was years before this Horus Uros sidekick idea, but then it was also um, like in college I took a bunch of philosophy classes, and there's this idea of progressing from ratio, logic or reasoning to intelligentsia, uh, which, obviously in English that just sounds like intelligence, but it's actually something more. It's like an understanding of the truth. And so this is like one of the things that like a person should aspire to get beyond mere ratio to intelligentsia. Ratio, of course, like Horatio is the thinking part of the Horus, so it is hor ratio, these two parts coming together. But also there's like Horatius in Roman history. So in 2005, I had read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It took me forever to read it, and I was it includes this reference. I think it's you know, in describing events, in the past, because the days of Horatius were long before the decline. But but this image of the sort of stoic lone warrior who is standing on the bridge, and uh, in defying the all those enemies in the world, right? That is who Horatio is in the game. The thing that's really cool is uh, Horatius Cocles, he's missing one of his eyes. Horus, the Egyptian god, is also missing one of his eyes. And it's just a coincidence of language. But anyway, so all this stuff goes into giving these characters their names. And I think Clarity and Charity is an instance of this where trying to figure out what would be the dyad that would cover the maximal range of approaches to the law. Um, and, when I was a law clerk, the judge who I worked for is very much like Clarity. She was basically the inspiration for Clarity. She even looked kind of like Clarity, although she was she was old, uh, the, but she was basically a law is a machine. The machine is governed by principles of physics and electricity and all these things, and it should behave in a predictable way. You press a button, and the same result should happen every time. Um, and the mechanical or logical view of the law can produce these injustices in an individual case. But it is a completely defensible intellectual position that over the main course of time, it is better to have a predictable machine because as you introduce unpredictability, this is Clarity's speech, right? Is that mercy is malware. It destroys the system in the long run. But we would always sit with two other judges on every panel. There'd be three judges, and probably about a third of the court had people who were more of Charity's mindset, which is you begin by asking, how do we achieve the kindest result in this case? And you basically start from asking what would be the charitable outcome, and then how close to that can we make the machine of law run? If we overclock this and we ignore that, where can we get? How can we make the machine generate that kind of an outcome? And so I knew that those were the two intellectual oppositions that I wanted to have, and then looking for the right words to express them. Clarity and charity is what I settled on.
It's so cool because they're so close. They're so close,
Yeah,
yet they're so apart. And there was a couple of quotes that I loved from Primordia. And then I like that I played the game after I knew that you were a lawyer. You are a lawyer. There's a quote like arbiter was removed, and then arbiter was murdered by another person, and then system user 2 is welcome to select his own terminology. It was like, okay, now I understand that that mindset. Also, Crispin, it's a sidekick that follows Horatio pretty much everywhere, and he's kind of a comic relief to the story often, and he tends to poke at the fourth wall a little bit. And I was wondering, how do you see this in terms of like you make a lot of effort to make the narrative, to soak players into narrative, to let them feel, understand what is happening, to be emotionally involved in everything. And then there's Crispin, who is sometimes like, hey, it's a game, kind of reminding and doing the opposite way. What do you think about this?
it's a good question. I mean, one of the reviews that most irritated me when Primordia came out referred to Crispin as a tonal wrecking ball. Um, and actually, when James and so about a year after the game's release, I should say, shortly after the game's release, James and I set to work on trying to polish it in various ways. And it was this one very large patch that we spent months and months on, improving cutscenes, improving gameplay, adding more sort of tutorial type stuff to help the player orient. Um, and one of the things in working through that, I actually did remove some of Crispin's most egregious wall breaking lines, or sort of like pop culture reference lines. Um, some of which players, if you look at like the most liked screenshot on Steam, it's a line that's no longer in the game. Um, that's like a reference to a Jay-Z song. But anyway, so this is to say, it is a your question pokes at a little bit of a sore point. I, Here's what I would say: adventure games are an inherently absurd genre. So you have a real problem, which is if you tell a completely serious story in an adventure game, it's like, uh, okay, really though? Like, this is a meditation on what it means to be human, told through the lens of an inhuman being, and you're sticking a finger up Goliath's nose? Like, uh, like really? Or and if you get one response to this is to say, well, we're just going to make the puzzles um, rigorously serious. It's not so much logical or illogical, but you're never going to do anything bonkers in the game. Everything is going to be very, uh, consistent with something you would see in like an Avengers movie, right? It's not going to be goofy. And the problem is, if you do that, the puzzles, in my experience, end up suffering. Um, so there are adventure games, to be sure, that have managed to maintain a serious tone by these changes, but I can't think of any of them where I liked the puzzles. And the ones where they maintain a serious tone, don't push on the fourth wall, don't have a tonal wrecking ball, and then have adventure game puzzles, people say those puzzles are idiotic. The Longest Journey is a good example of this. Gabriel Knight 3 is a good example of this. The two most notorious puzzles in point and click adventure games are, in Gabriel Knight 3, you you imitate someone by creating a fake ID, using tape to pull fur off a cat, using the cat fur to make your mustache. And this puzzle was ridiculed by a site called Old Man Murray in an article called What Killed Adventure Games. The answer being the adventure games killed themselves, as if it were the um, epitome of what every adventure game puzzle was, when in fact it was a standoutly bad puzzle, not the typical puzzle. The other is in The Longest Journey. There's like a puzzle that involves attaching a rubber ducky to a fishing pole and all these things. The problem is not with the puzzles. Both of those puzzles would have been great in Maniac Mansion, in Monkey Island. People, in fact, would have said, that's one of my favorite puzzles of all time, was when you pull the fur off a cat and you make a fake mustache. It was hilarious. The problem is that if you have a game that's like, this is a serious game about the Templars and evil international conspiracies, then you're like, oh, by the way, Gabriel Knight, stoic literary hero, is pulling hair off a cat. Then people have a hostile reaction. So my solution, such that it was, is to have Crispin basically there occasionally to wink at the player and say, like, there's something, of course, this is something a little bit ridiculous. And to be just enough to mediate between the sometimes ridiculous nature of adventure game conventions and the fairly serious storyline of the game. Um, but like I said, I think some of those overshot. We took some of those out. Um, and anyway, that's sort of the fourth wall side of it. I also I really enjoy references and cross references. I think it's part of that like conversation between the developer and the player, where there is, in particular, people seem to really like the Fallout references and in Primordia. Fallout's one of my favorite games. We have a couple of like throwaway references to it. People really connect to those. Those are also breaking the fourth wall. There's no reason why there should be a Garden of Eden creation kit in anything other than the Fallout setting. But there's anyway. Um, the other thing I will just say about Crispin, though, that was my main reaction to the tonal wrecking ball criticism, is setting aside the fourth wall points. It is he is part of the texture of the game's tone. So you can't, it's like the second most lines of dialogue in the game are coming from this character. So you can't say the character is contrary to the game's tone. He is the game's undertone. And I think his relationship with Horatio um, is so integral to the game, and the straight man comedic sidekick dynamic. Actually, what that sets up are a couple of very serious moments. So one is at one point, it's like the game occasionally has these like idle dialogues where if like a certain amount of time has passed and nothing has happened, the characters will just talk to each other. And one of them is Crispin asks, and Abe Goldfarb, who's brought the character to life, delivers these lines perfectly, asks sort of in this voice of a scared child, like, what is happening to the world? Like, and what does humanism have to say about this? If the world was such a perfect place, how did it get to be this way? Why would anyone build it this way? And that question and the way Horatio answers it in this paternal or maybe older brother kind of way um, couldn't exist unless you had first set up Crispin as the everything washes off him. He doesn't take anything seriously. And likewise, the moment where he sacrifices himself, I think is develops some of its strength from this feeling that he's like a glib character and not someone who would be the one making the grand heroic gesture. You expect the grand heroic gesture to come from Horatio or Clarity or Ever Faithful, and not from this guy who's joking about light bulbs the whole time.
Okay. On Ever Faithful, and then we can move to Strangeland because we're pressed on time and we gotta talk about Strangeland. But Ever Faithful, you mentioned before that you are doing your research. You from law you learned that you should do your research when you're trying to be, for example, speaking with religious undertones, and you could tell that like it's not a like faked religious dialogue because like I barely understood it as non-native English speaker. It was it was difficult to understand it. How deep do you get with this research, both for like things like Ever Faithful, but also poetry that will be very visible in Strangeland, but also in Primordia? Like how much do you need to do this research and get down into the details to actually feel that you're capable of doing something of high quality?
I mean, it depends. It's very situational. With Ever Faithful, because of this experience of having the religious friends in law school, they re that interaction with them made me realize that I had never read the Bible, and I ought to read it. It's a foundational text for the Western culture, and it's so woven. When I talk about I like putting Fallout references into my game. Well, almost all of Western literature is full of biblical references, and ought I not to be aware of what those are? And in particular, the cadence and some of the things in the King James version of the English Bible um, are really deeply embedded in even conventional modern speech. So that was something that I had read not long before Primordia, and so I was already immersed in that aspect of it. And then this idea of like religion in a post-apocalyptic setting has always, I don't know, not always, but for a very, very long time, it seemed integral to me because, you have in like uh, the first post-apocalyptic art that I really engaged with was the game Wasteland. Wasteland has the servants of the mushroom cloud who are religious worshippers of a nuclear plant. They are clearly inspired by a movie I saw later, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, where you have them worshiping the Alpha and Omega bomb. And, you see this again and again throughout um, post-apocalyptic settings of this idea of bombs and nuclear weapons becoming objects of worship and veneration. And so, this was an instance of like having a lot of like both art and life that was inspiring me on this character. So I didn't spend time like researching a lot for Ever Faithful. That character just sort of bubbled up very quickly. Um, the poetry, uh, it's less about research, it's just about time. Even sort of doggerel poetry, like what you have from Primer and Primordia, it does take time to do rhymes and meter and things like that. And I remember after doing Primer saying, I'm never, ever, ever going to do a rhyming character again. It's just too much work. Uh, and then, of course, we get to Strangeland, and it's like every other character is
Yeah.
somehow doing poetry.
Okay. Let's then turn to Strangeland. Um, you kind of already opened the discussion that the game is quite personal and the narrative is very personal. How player is intended to grapple with the narrative? It's very like psychological. It's how is it like me as a player am I supposed to treat this and try to find like substitutions for this, like how interpret this in the framework that I see, because like there are with each character and with each situation you can draw parallels to your life, to your situation, to the emotions and stuff like that. What would be the, let's say, your intention in Strangeland?
Uh, I would say it is a much more selfish narrative than other stories I've written. I was not particularly concerned about um, how is this going to connect to other players. This was me processing um, my own life and the particular grief I was feeling about the death of my grandparents. And so it was, um, a happy coincidence that the game connects with people, but it was not, um, my thought was not, let me tell a universal story. Everyone is going to feel like Norse mythology connects with the pagan to Jewish to Christian religious traditions to carnivals, to all these. No, I mean, this was a set of idiosyncratic elements of my own life that but I think touching on certain common themes. So if you take like the voice on the other end of the phone call and the things that that character says, this required no research for me. This is the voice that I've heard in my head my entire life.
They're
Like
angry.
there's
They're
yeah,
angry. They're
and
most angry, I think.
yeah, and these are like I don't have to imagine what it would be like to have your own inner monologue questioning everything that you do because I think some people are fortunate not to have brains that work that way, but for a variety of reasons, I think things that happened in my childhood, that just has been, you know, my life experience. So, but that being said, I think everyone who has gone through periods of like depression or self-doubt or self-loathing has heard some version of those words from the voice in their head. And so you know, many players have reached out and said it is uncanny that, verbatim things that you have a character saying in that phone on, the shadow version of, the protagonist is saying over the phone, like, that, like those exact words are things that I've heard in my head, which I think just goes to the universality of certain human experiences. Um, Likewise, I don't think everyone um, has a blonde love of their life who saved them from despair. I do. Um, right? The woman is like, if I had not met my wife when we were 18, I would not be anything like, I don't even know if I'd be alive, but I would not be the person I am today. So the role that the woman plays for the protagonist in that game is immensely personal to me. I think some people have played it and been like, why is it being presented as though this is a universal, everyone should have this? That isn't my intention at all. And that, again, it's personal. But I think eh, anyone who has suffered probably has someone in their life who has played that role of pulling you out of the suffering, whether it was a teacher, a minister, a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a child, a friend, um, there's a teammate. There are these moments in our lives where sometimes it's a very small gesture. It's someone standing up for you when you're being picked on, and that's the only interaction you have with the person. But a sense that there are actually others out there who are there to protect rather than to hurt you, can be a transformative experience. And I think so most people, I think, will find something like that in there. But the particular uh, skins that these feelings wear in the game are probably not things that everyone is going to, you know, yeah, I don't know, a blind old man under a tree is not necessarily how everyone is going to picture the part of themselves that just strives after like an intellectual answer to their problems, right? It's a idiosyncratic expression of that, but I think all of us have at some point felt the futility of trying to reason through or study through or learn our way out of emotional or existential problems.
Okay. So th- the characters do, because like narratively through the game there is the part of the game where each character turns into the protagonist version of the character, and it kind of like hints heavily at the, let's say, that these characters were part of yourself pretty much for the entirety of the game. And was this your idea to have different kinds of your psyche, let's say, or inner voices depicted as different kinds of characters? For example, even for the wolf or the musketeers.
Yeah. Um, so I, I guess my intention is that when we are wounded psychologically and emotionally, we respond to that wounding with different coping mechanisms. And I wanted to have those coping mechanisms, most of which are unhealthy, um, to have characteristics because in the context of an adventure game, to go back to where we were 2 hours ago in the conversation, there has to be like a functional role that these things have. And so the functional role would be to take one of the ways in which the protagonist had coped with the grief of losing the woman who had saved him from despair, um, would be self-loathing, right? Another way would be losing himself in his work. Another way would be um, to try to recast her in some kind of symbolic way to preserve her as like an imago rather than as a real vital person who had existed in his life. Um, and then, not everyone you meet in Strangeland is a coping mechanism in response to just the woman's loss. Things like Rota. Um, Rota is like the embodiment of the self-loathing, of the bargains that people make to live. You're always um, trading things that you dreamed of for the practical realities of how you have to get through life. you're diminished. Rota, of course, is this sort of rat-like dwarf who is this diminution of the angelic being that a human ought to be. Um, and he talks about having sold out his younger self, which you find as this rat filled with silver or whatever. So these things are all parts of the self, or they're coping mechanisms of the self. um and in some ways, as a writer, like, I can only write in a voice that is my own voice. And so all of these characters, in both games and all the games I do, they are just different parts of myself, emphasizing and shrinking different things to try to reach these ranges. In the same way that when you get to the last part of the game, all the characters are voiced by Abe Goldfarb, same guy who voiced Crispin. Those are all Abe's voices, right? There isn't a Abe and a not Abe in there. But if you ever just talk with Abe, none of those are the Abe you would just talk to on the phone when he and I were talking about how to reach these characters and about what they meant, the characters, their emotional role and emotional relationship to me. The voice of Abe when I'm talking to him, I was like, there's a some of Crispin in there, and there's some of the stranger in there, and there's some of the scribe in there, but like actually there's just a a whole human being who isn't any of the voices that I've heard in the games. That was the first time I had just talked to Abe. And in the same way, like, all these characters ultimately have to come from a single, if it's one writer writing all of them, they're all coming from the same character of the author, just distorting and reflecting different things. Um, and I think this is particularly true in Strangeland. So, I mentioned the criticism of Primordia that irritated me the most was this tonal wrecking ball one. The criticism of Strangeland that I'm always taken aback by is when people say it's just a random collection of references. Uh, and it's like, well, sort of. It happens to be the random collection of references that makes up me and makes up the art, of course. It makes up Vic, or makes up you know Abe. The references are going to be references that make up Abe, but you know it's not random that you see um, this effort to sort of reconcile and integrate the Locusena, which is the binding of Loki and the serpent there, with the role of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Like, okay, that, like, how you fit those two myths together in human nature is something that fascinates me. It's not in the game because I was like, I'm just going to start reaching into random buckets and pulling out ideas. It's that, you know, the indulgence of the game was to take all these disparate topics that are fascinating to me. Um, Whether it's you know I don't know, the Norse mythology is fascinating. It's been what I've been working on fallen gods, the religious themes that have been percolating from childhood, the philosophical themes I studied in college, and all, I don't know, Ray Bradbury elements from the Ray Bradbury stories I loved as a young man. All of these things uh, have their common ground in the creators of the game, right? Um, Now maybe they aren't coherent for everyone, but they cohere into who I am. So for me, they're very coherent.
And they're not random. They're symbolic, right, and not straightforward. Uh, you in our previous conversation you mentioned the distinction between depression and melancholy, and I think you should voice that distinction because I loved it. It's great.
Yeah, so I don't know that this is right. It is not defensible etymologically. It's not, I think probably is not defensible even in like medieval views of the humors or in modern views of psychology. But for me, the key distinction is a melancholy story is the world sucks and you're going to die, so you might as well die on your feet. And a depressing story is the world sucks and you're going to die. You might as well not embarrass yourself by trying to stand up. And, to take two sort of examples of the same author creating what I consider a melancholy and a depressing work, Aronofsky made Requiem for a Dream, which I consider a sort of extreme example of depressing, and made The Wrestler, which is an extreme example of melancholy. So many people say The Wrestler is a depressing story. It's about this loser Hulk Hogan pastiche who's now working as a deli clerk and his life sucks. He lives in a trailer. He's estranged from his family. He's, a junkie and, addicted to painkillers, and he's using steroids. And in the end of the movie, he can't mature past being a wrestler and he dies in the ring. Spoiler, now that I've spoiled the whole movie for you.
Thanks.
He dies in the ring, jumping off the top rope, doing the move that defined him as a wrestler to the applause of the crowd. To me, the actual ending of that movie, and this goes back to my flying, falling, right? He dies in flight, uh, embodying this larger than life role that had been the high point of his life. It's true, he was not able to mature past this and didn't become a lawyer and sit at a desk all day till he died with sciatica or something. He died of over, abusing painkillers and jumping off the top rope. But that moment, it doesn't take any, I have no question in my mind that he died with a smile on his face. You could just as easily have made the same movie and he dies before going into the ring because he overdoses on painkillers. And it would be a completely different movie that would just basically be saying his efforts to strive back to getting to that point when he meant something to people and meant something to himself was all a futility that was just an excuse to abuse drugs or whatever. And that would be a depressing message. And to me, I'm like, I anyone who's played these games has a guess at how dark my ideations can be. I am very worried about the state of the world, um, and whether humanity is capable of meeting the challenges that we're facing, whether the way we'll meet the challenges that we're facing aren't going to be awful in and of themselves, and what are we going to lose by trying to cope with these catastrophes. I'm very worried about those things, and so to me, um, games are always educational, right? They are particularly powerful in building patterns of thought and action in people who play games. And so I recoil at the idea of doing a depressing game because I think all of us need the message to stand on your feet, not to die on your knees, even though we may all end up dying on our knees. And it's not so great to die on your feet either. But if there is any hope of anything other than dying on your feet, it's to get on your feet because you're not going to survive on your knees waiting for the shit of the world to drown you. You're going to survive because you're resisting it until the end. And, you Martin Luther, who certainly said a lot of things I would not agree with, and he is a complicated figure. But there's a quote that I'm not going to get right, and maybe he didn't even say it, but I believe he said, when asked, if you believed the world was going to end tomorrow, what would you do? And his answer was, I would plant a tree. Um, we live in a world where people people still plant trees, but they plant trees that are going to grow as fast as possible because they want to have the tree in their own lifetime. People tend not to plant oaks, which take generations to grow, because they don't think in terms of a future that will extend past the metaphorical tomorrow. And what I think Luther was saying there is even, uh, you know, uh, in Watchmen, Rorschach says, even in the face of Armageddon, never compromise. Well, Luther is also saying a version of that, which is even in the face of the end of the world, continue to live as if what you're doing has meaning. And that is, as long as that is there, it's never truly depressing. The notion that there is dignity even in defeat, as long as you meet the defeat in a dignified way, um, is one of the great gifts of philosophy and religion to the world, right? The idea that all that matters is whether you win or lose is one of the most corrosive things that a person can internalize, because it can certainly drive you to excel, but it will also, at the critical juncture, it will fail you in one of two ways. Either you will lose because, as Dr. Seuss says in Oh, the Places You Go, sometimes you lose, right? You're not, and when you lose, if you believe that everything was about winning and losing, you have nothing left to fall back on. But it can also be corrosive in that in the pursuit of winning, you lose sight of what the goal really was, right? The goal was not the winning itself. It was the thing that winning was supposed to enable you to do, or give you, or enable others to do. And so I just think there is some value in this message, that it's actually about how you perform and not the outcome of it. And so that was, in those games, it's in every game I do, is, you know, they're all the games are either post-apocalyptic or pre-apocalyptic, but there is overwhelming all of them, from the first Game Boy game until Fallen Gods, is this sense that uh, the world is either ended and you just have to make do as best you can, or the world is falling apart and you have to figure out how to cope with the world's falling apart, or the world is on the cusp of falling apart. And what are you going to do in the face of that? Are you going to indulge yourself in, you know, getting drunk and gambling, or are you going to go and try to do something creative and constructive? And all of the games are, you know, in different stages of maturity in my own life. And the answer to that, Strangeland is like a middle-aged person's game, right? It's a game about, a loss and the things that you've lost along the way. Infinity, which I made when I was 18 or whatever, is a game. It's a young man's notion of, you shrug off everything and with a heroic gesture, and everything is noble sacrifice this, and defiant gesture that. But both of them, I think, are driving at the same melancholy rather than depression.
I think that's a great place to end with this message. I think I still have like another full page of questions, but I guess we'll need to do this another time
Okay.
because I don't think we'll top that top that response. Uh, okay, you're working now on Fallen Gods. Just tell me where all the people who listen can follow the developments. Where can people wishlist and stuff like that?
It's on Steam. I'm sure it'll be on GOG when we ultimately release it. We also have a Twitter account, WWS Games, um, and there's a Discord that's linked off of our Steam page. Wormwoodstudios.com is our website. Um, and, it's between juggling a day job and family and game development and game promotion. There are, like, sometimes there'll be a stretch where I'll write a bunch of dev diaries in like a 6 month span, and then we'll go 6 years without really any dev diaries. And right now, I would say we're more in the focused on development than focused on marketing. But if you go to the website, there are, 6 or 8 very long dev diaries. And if you go to the Steam page, there are interviews with all of the people who are currently active in the development team. People who have been on the team and cycled off aren't in the interviews, just because some of them I didn't know how to contact, and some of them moved on to other things. But both of those are pretty good places to learn about the game.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for a lovely
My
discussion.
pleasure.
I really like that. You have so many interesting thoughts and interesting takes for game development and life. So, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for all your time.